If there is such a thing as an ancient conspiracy theory, this is it.
Is there a big conspiracy to prevent major excavations at Göbekli Tepe? Some people would like you to believe that there is. How credible are those claims? Jimmy Corsetti, who has a YouTube channel called Bright Insight, has been a highly vocal and influential proponent of the claim that excavations at Göbekli Tepe have not progressed over the past 16 years, and especially over the past 7 years or so, and that there is some kind of conspiracy, one he associates with the World Economic Forum, to prevent knowledge about the site from coming out. He goes as far as to say,
To not excavate this site is a borderline crime against humanity.
so what is Corsetti's evidence that the excavations have not progressed? He starts with an estimate that only 5% of the site has been excavated, and then continues.
I took it upon myself to do some inquiring as to what advances of excavations have occurred at this site in the last several years since that 5% figure received international attention. And I was stunned to learn that it had not changed at all in the years between 2017 and 2021, as reported by the WorldHeritageFund.org. However, 2021 is 3 years ago now, so I searched further and found a 2023 article that included a quote by a professional guide that works at Göbekli Tepe, and she stated that the estimate was still only at 5%. How is it possible that no measurable advances to this dig have been made? I mean, excavations began 29 years ago, nearly a third of a century. So why are we still at 5%, and what is the holdup?
Corsetti attributes this 5% number to a 2008 article by Nicholas Birch on EurasiaNet. It may originally have come from Klaus Schmidt himself, the director of the excavations at the site until his untimely death in 2013. Whatever the original source of the estimate, by 2008, and aside from very small excavations of the 1990s in the quarry and at the so-called Rock Temple, the only excavations that had been completely opened were in the main area and the trench that extends across the southwest hill. Those total 4,100 square meters in area. After that, Corsetti just cites some articles in the popular media and press releases by the Global Heritage Fund that consistently repeat that 5% estimate. Did Corsetti bother to check to see if this 5% estimate was actually based on anything? Or did he, just like those journalists and the Global Heritage Fund, just take the lazy way out of citing a figure that was way out of date? Well, even if we only consider the area of excavation, the claim that there has been no progress on the excavations is clearly false. After 2006, the Turkish-German team opened up entirely new excavation areas in the northwest part of the site, and these total 2,000 square meters in size. The increase in area from 2006 to 2013, when those new excavations had reached their maximum area, is about 49%. That hardly constitutes inactivity. But let's do some back-of-the-envelope calculations. Corsetti claims the site's area is 22 acres or 8.9 hectares. I'd suggest that's exaggerated, and he doesn't say where he gets that number. If I estimate the approximate boundaries of the site, that's never a precise thing, I get something more like 4.7 hectares. Even 6 hectares strikes me as possible, but unlikely. In what follows, I'll exclude the area of the so-called Rock Temple building in the extreme southwestern part of the site because it was hardly buried at all and so involved relatively little excavation. If my 4.7 hectare estimate is reasonable, then the main area plus the western trench, which as of 2006 totaled 4,100 square meters, would constitute some 8% of the site area, already higher than 5%. Addition of the two northwestern excavation areas, totaling 1,200 and 800 square meters by 2013, brings the total to 6,100 square meters, or about 13% of the site area. Even if we use the larger estimate of site size at 6 hectares, they'd constitute about 10% of the site area, a pretty reasonable portion. For that matter, even if we accept Corsetti's high 22-acre figures for the site's area, these excavations work out to almost 7%. But okay, it's true that that area has not significantly increased since 2013. Is that a problem? People like Corsetti either forget or ignore that archaeological excavation doesn't only involve area, it involves volume. Many of the excavations have not yet gotten very deep, and it will take many years to excavate them down to floor levels. Just look at how deep some of these foundations are. However, the focus since 2013 has mainly been on finishing the excavations in the main area of the site around buildings A, B, C, and D. Not only had the floors of those buildings not been fully exposed until fairly recently, work was also needed to clarify some of the stratigraphic relationships among the various walls and rebuilding episodes. During the period when Corsetti suggests there was so little excavation activity, building B, for example, went from this to this. The floor is now almost fully exposed. Most of the sediment that was obscuring outer pillars has been removed, and deep excavations at the north end have even exposed an early phase of the building not previously known. Archaeology is not just a matter of exhuming pillars, as Corsetti seems to think. And it was also necessary to excavate deep soundings wherever the footings for the new roof structure had to be placed. These deep soundings were instrumental in identifying all kinds of pre-pottery Neolithic A domestic structures in the vicinity of the big buildings, as well as details about the earliest features of the monumental buildings. Corsetti admits that excavations have not entirely stopped, but minimizes the importance of these smaller scale excavations that have, nonetheless, been extremely important both to prepare the site for tourism and to improve our understanding of both the big monumental structures and the small domestic buildings that had hitherto received almost no attention. He's instead fixated on this concept of full excavation, a point I'll return to later in this video.
But wait a second. What do you mean Göbekli Tepe will be left for future generations?
Here, Corsetti mocks the suggestion that people would want to preserve parts of Göbekli Tepe unexcavated for future generations. Here he is again.
The most mysterious ancient site on Earth has been essentially infiltrated by powerful outside forces, which are now inexplicably deferring a full excavation of Göbekli Tepe to future generations, bizarrely stating that they will be focusing on tourism and conservation rather than large-scale excavations as done in all the years prior, going as far as to say that a complete excavation of this profound site is now projected to be as far away as 150 years down the road, which of course makes absolutely no sense.
Absolutely no sense? In point of fact, preservation for the future is a normal ethic in archaeology. Archaeologists are acutely aware that excavation is an inherently destructive process. Once we excavate deposits away, we can never put them back just the way they were. That is why archaeologists almost never excavate entire sites. We almost only do that when a site is going to be destroyed by modern development. In addition, surely Corsetti doesn't mean to imply that we shouldn't be conserving the parts of the site already excavated. Clearly, it was a priority circa 2015 to get the excavation areas roofed over, to stabilize the exposed pillars, and to consolidate the earthen walls at the edges of the excavation areas that would be vulnerable to collapse. All of that takes time, and it seems to me it was not unreasonable to make that a priority for a few years. But even if we wanted to fully excavate a site as large and impactful as Göbekli Tepe, it would take an extremely long time. By Corsetti's own claims, a couple of decades of excavations there only resulted in exposing 5% of the site. By that calculation, full excavation would take something like 400 years. In the clip I just played, he purposely misrepresents his sources. Let's play that part again and see how what he says compares to what he's supposedly quoting.
Complete excavation of this profound site is now projected to be as far away as 150 years down the road.
Look at what the article he's citing actually says. It's even underlined. Does it say that there will be no excavations for 150 years? No. Or that excavation will be extremely limited for 150 years? No again. What it actually says is that excavations, quote, are expected to continue for another 150 years, unquote. Admittedly, Corsetti doesn't actually say there will be no excavations at all for 150 years, but that's the impression he's giving, and that impression is almost certainly intentional, especially as he's well aware that a full excavation, even if that were desirable, would take a very long time. Furthermore, Corsetti apparently objects to the idea of concentrating on site preservation.
They very clearly stated that the focus at Göbekli Tepe is now around tourism and conservation of the site rather than excavations. Here is a quote from Dr. Kurul. Plans for the near future in Göbekli Tepe were made on the conservation and consolidation of existing areas rather than further excavation.
Note that the Nesmi Karel quote explicitly refers to the near future, not the long term. Nothing in the sources that Corsetti cites says there will be no significant excavations in the future. Notwithstanding Corsetti's quotation of Lee Clare, coordinator of the Göbekli project for the German Archaeological Institute, that future digging at the site will be limited in comparison to the past. That does not mean it will be insignificant. According to my sources among the German team, excavations in the northwest area are expected to resume in 2026, and that area is large enough, as I've already outlined, that it could yield very important new insights. And knowing what we now know about Göbekli Tepe will allow the archaeologists to target their excavations to answer specific questions about the site. Furthermore, Cassetti cites, without irony, information that a tourism company, the Dalrush Group, is contributing $15 million toward continuing excavations at the site. It's right here in his first video on this topic.
Which includes, and I quote, a generous donation for the ongoing excavations at this site, a sum of $15 million.
Somehow, Corsetti manages to warp that into a conspiracy to halt the excavations. He continues to imply that excavations have come to a near standstill at the same time that he quotes Nesmi Karel saying,
Attempts to create a perception that Göbekli Tepe excavations have been halted. These allegations are totally unfounded. Yeah, I did not say that, and you're ignoring the fact that the concern is that a full excavation has been deferred for hundreds of years.
Never let an on-the-record denial or actual evidence get in the way of a good conspiracy theory. While it's true that Corsetti does acknowledge that some archaeology is still going on, he continues to give the impression that no serious archaeology will take place for decades. Corsetti also makes much of the idea that the current roof structures and walkways prevent a, quote, full excavation, unquote, of the site.
Notice in these various images, including different angles around the site, clearly show that the permanent viewing platform is not only obstructing the view of different parts of the site, which is a bit ironic, but more importantly, it is quite literally impeding the site from being fully excavated as it's sitting directly on top of portions of the site that have not yet been dug. In fact, observe the walkway that surrounds the entire area, and notice that it's covering areas which still contain buried ruins. And speaking of walkways, it's worth mentioning that there are a total of 900 meters of walkways that were constructed here after this partnership began.
Even if this were true, why on earth would that be a problem? By his own claims, something like 95% of the site is available for excavation, and it would take more than a century to excavate all of that. Surely there are plenty of opportunities to excavate at the site without having to remove any of the current tourism infrastructure, which occupies far less than 1% of the site area. In any case, as you can see clearly in the very images that Corsetti shows, those walkways are suspended above the archaeological deposits and would not really impede future excavations at all if those were deemed necessary or desirable. Going further, Corsetti cites Klaus Schmidt's widow for criticism of the roads and walkways at the site, claiming that they damaged the site. Here's what he says.
Now they are building a permanent concrete walkway instead, she said. And she took it upon herself to share photos on her Instagram at what had taken place, which led the Ministry of Culture and Tourism to issue a statement saying that, quote, only construction equipment was used there, and went on to outright deny that concrete or asphalt was used there. Gee, that sure looks like concrete to me, wouldn't you say? But to make it worse, the ministry doubled down on their claims, saying that the allegations made by Mrs. Schmidt were, quote, baseless and unscientific, and they strongly denied that any historical assets had been damaged.
I'm aware that there was some controversy about this, and I can't speak to this in detail since I was never there while this infrastructure was being built. However, you'll note that Corsetti ignored the part of the statement by the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism that states, and I quote, Protective felt was placed on the soil before construction of the 900-meter walkway started, and cube stones were placed on the felt. In other words, this infrastructure was not poured concrete, and it was designed to float over the existing soil rather than being dug into it. When I look at the very images that Corsetti offers, I don't see poured concrete. I see blocks of paving stones and even wood planks being placed on a layer of grout on top of landscaping felt, just as the ministry indicated. But Corsetti continues to claim that these were concrete roads, rather than roads made up of pavers placed over landscaping felt. No tourism infrastructure is going to be perfect, in the sense of doing no damage at all. But it seems that the stewards of this site were trying hard to be as unintrusive as possible. And as the construction equipment needed roads to minimize their damage to the site, they came up with a solution for roads that would be temporary. Yet Corsetti implies that all these alleged concrete paths and roads were permanent and returns to that theme that they're preventing, quote, full excavation, unquote, of the site.
Think about it. They would have to dig up all those roads, the rock, the asphalt, concrete walkways, as well as remove the infrastructure of the protective roofs themselves to make a full excavation of Göbekli Tepe even possible. In other words, they clearly have no intention to do so for the foreseeable future, as we can all see.
And Corsetti goes as far as to contradict the ministry's statement about the roads by saying,
The reality is that the evidence is there for all of us to see now.
well, what do we see? Corsetti made that statement only a short while before I visited the site in November of 2024. At that time, there were no concrete paths or roads on the site itself, only boardwalks elevated above the surface and supported by steel pillars and struts that were widely spaced so as to minimize any damage to the site. In other words, what we can plainly see with our own eyes, for that matter, even in the images Corsetti himself uses, clearly contradicts his claims. Those 900 meters of pathways are elevated wooden boardwalks with steel frames, not concrete paths. As for the roads, currently the road stops just off-site before you reach the so-called stone garden, where they store a lot of carved stones from the excavations. There may have been some of those floating roads on the site while construction of the roofs was underway. They'd need that to allow access by trucks and cranes, but there's no trace of it today. You can easily see the roads in this 2017 aerial image, taken before the roof structures were complete, but they are gone in this later image from 2020. Presumably, once construction was complete, they were able to remove the paving stones and underlying felt and return the land to something similar to its earlier appearance. Far from having to remove roads before excavation, the roads have already been removed. I wouldn't claim that this had zero impact on the site, but that impact was at least minimized, especially when you consider that most of the Neolithic architecture in the affected areas is probably at least 50 centimeters below ground level. Yet, despite the clear contradictions of his own claims, Crosetti continues.
900 meters of concrete walkway were installed.
And
They literally covered ruins in concrete, which again is just another example of something that is now preventing a full excavation of this site.
Corsetti is also very critical of those steel pillars that support the walkways and the roof.
As was described in their agenda, the first steps involved in the 20-year partnership was setting up the infrastructure for tourism and preservation, which included protective roofs in order to prevent weather and the elements from affecting this now exposed site. However, notice that the very foundation and support beams of this roof is comprised of, what it's comprised of is literally stabbing into the ruins itself.
Meanwhile, Corsetti also criticizes the fact that the roof doesn't keep out snow.
There are protective roofs that they installed over the site that don't even function properly. They were meant to conserve the site and protect the exposed ruins from the elements. But do you see all this snow? This is there despite the roofs above.
I'm not sure what Corsetti expects. If they built a completely weatherproof structure, it would have been much heavier and would have required large concrete footings, even larger than those used previously for the old roof over the more northern excavation. Those steel pillars they did use are small and widely spaced, and they didn't just stab them into the site, they carefully excavated soundings wherever they were to go and documented the archaeology there. Protective infrastructure for high visibility sites is always a compromise. The only way to protect a site from the elements without such damaging infrastructure is to rebury it. Corsetti also calls attention to the trees planted on Göbekli Tepe, implying that their existence there is part of some conspiracy to prevent excavation of large parts of the site. Here's what he says in 2 videos.
By the way, here's a question. When exactly were these 2 orchards of trees, which are located in the midst of ruins of Göbekli Tepe, when were they planted? Because I found an aerial photograph from 2004, and as you can see, these 2 sets of orchards were not there at this time as compared to a more recent photo. Do any ancient ruins lie underneath these orchards? I mean, that is a sincere question, as I do not know if that is the case or not. All I did was ask a sincere yet very important question. And after that video, I got in touch with an archaeologist who physically conducted excavations at Göbekli Tepe, and I was shocked to learn that yes, all of these trees, 4 orchards in total, were indeed planted on top of buried ruins at Göbekli Tepe more than a decade after excavations first began, which only further validates that there is no intention for the foreseeable future to fully excavate this site, as they would have to cut them all down to do so.
Sure, in that 2004 photo, you can't see any trees. And in a 2006 Google Earth image, you can see that the trees had already been planted by then. At that time, this was still private farmland owned by the Yildiz family, and the trees have grown since, as you can see over a series of Google Earth images. Corsetti knows this, as he corresponded with the Turkish prehistorian Nesmi Karol about this issue.
Although Dr. Karul explains that it was the landowners themselves that planted the trees, the reason behind it also makes no sense, as he claims that it was in order to increase the value of the land. Well, that's interesting. Are we really going to pretend that planting olive trees at the world's oldest and most mysterious ancient site is going to increase the value in any way?
Corsetti ridicules Karol's explanation that the landowner planted the trees to increase the land's value so that he could maximize what he'd receive when the government expropriated the land. Corsetti proves that he knows no more about arboriculture or land values than he knows about Neolithic archaeology. Of course the olive trees increase the land value, and substantially. Olive trees, in less than 12 years from their planting, produce reliable crops of olives every couple of years with very little effort by the farmers other than harvesting them. Olive groves are very economically important. There's no question that the landowner was being very prudent in planting those trees, as it likely got him a much higher price for his land when the government expropriated it. But Corsetti goes on.
The fact remains that these hundreds of trees are sitting on top of ancient ruins, and their roots could potentially damage those ruins. And it is a matter of fact that it is not possible to fully excavate this site with those trees there. This is the reality of the situation.
Are there archaeological remains under those trees' roots? I think there's no doubt that there are, probably lots of them. But are the trees damaging the archaeological remains? Corsetti actually corresponded about this with Oliver Dietrich, who was on the Göbekli Tepe team for at least 15 years. He told him that the depth of rubble above the Neolithic levels in these parts of the site was likely at least 1 meter, and that the trees are probably helping to control erosion on this highly sloping site. Are trees an impediment to large-scale excavation? Well, sure, as it would be necessary to remove them anywhere where you wanted to put an extensive excavation area. However, archaeologists face bigger problems than that all the time. In fact, in one of my other videos, I note that they've demolished several modern houses in the village of Seburg to allow excavations there. Furthermore, there are huge parts of this site that are not covered by trees, and currently no particular reason to favor excavation in the orchards rather than one of the currently bare parts of the site. They could excavate this site for many decades without ever having to venture into the treed areas.
I have to say that to not fully excavate this site is a borderline crime against humanity. In fact, it's totally inexcusable. All of the estimated 200 pillars need to be exhumed and studied.
Note here that Corsetti seems to think, or at least he gives his viewers the impression, that the only goal of excavation at Göbekli Tepe is to mine it for pillars. Sure, many of the pillars are amazing, and we'll probably be spending decades trying to understand the imagery on the ones already found, and any more found in the future. But the pillars are just the most obvious aspect of the archaeology here. To understand the site properly does not involve rapidly excavating as many pillars as possible. It involves carefully and painstakingly excavating the sediments, artifacts, animal bones, plant remains, and other residues in and around the architecture to help us understand what people were doing at this site, which Corsetti himself claims is one of the most important sites in the world. Excavating it too rapidly, just to maximize our yield of pillars, would indeed be a crime.
Do we all understand what I'm saying? To not fully excavate this site for hundreds of years and save it for future generations is insanity. And it's either because of mismanagement, incompetence, or corruption. Because the fact that it's remained at only 5% excavated for at least the last 7 years says it all. And let's not forget that they told us directly that they are not going to fully excavate this site. Remember, they are leaving it for, quote, future generations. I honestly cannot believe the current state of modern archaeology today. It appears to have been corrupted, or at best, totally mismanaged at such a level that is now preventing us from actually learning information about our ancient past. I mean, to have an archaeological dig and not dig it up is the antithesis of actual archaeology, is it not?
Well, actually, it's not. Archaeology is not just a quest to dig things up. That's relic hunting, not archaeology. In another, he quotes a message on X from the project leader Lee Clare.
In fact, I communicated with him directly on X, where I very specifically asked him to clarify that as of right now, there is no plan to fully excavate Göbekli Tepe for the indefinite future. And he said yes. And he went on to say that he doesn't even think that the site should be fully excavated.
Corsetti clearly implies here that there's something terribly wrong about not fully excavating an important site quickly, or at all. He's either being disingenuous or he's simply ignorant about ethics, economics, and practicality in archaeology. Lee Clare's response was perfectly reasonable. Have we excavated all of Rome? Or all of Athens? Of course not. Note all those trees, by the way. Admittedly, those are cities still occupied, so what about sites that are not? Have we excavated all of Palenque? No, probably only 5%. And geez, more trees. What about colonial Williamsburg? Probably less than 20%. What about Uruk in Mesopotamia? Admittedly, it's a huge site, but 39 excavation seasons, often using crude, fast methods since 1850, have excavated less than 5%. Getting back to Turkey, how about the famous Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük? After 5 seasons by James Millart's and 25 years of excavation by Ian Hodder's teams, probably only about 5% of the East Mount has been excavated. These are all immensely important sites, and we've been able to learn a great deal from them despite having only small samples excavated. If Corsetti is trying to claim that Göbekli Tepe is getting less archaeological attention than other important sites, he's going to have to try a lot harder than this. Corsetti specifically ridicules Lee Clare's claim that one of the reasons to preserve parts of a site like this for the future is that archaeological methods will improve and new methods will be developed. Here's what he says.
And get this, he bizarrely made an excuse that they should wait for technological advances in the future that would allow for less destructive excavation methods. But this is complete and total gaslighting. It's 2024, and we absolutely have the ability to safely unearth the remaining T-pillars at this site. I mean, think about it. What alleged future technology will allow us to dig up these pillars any differently? We already have pressure washers and paintbrushes. Yes, paintbrushes which are used by archaeologists around the world to safely excavate. We also have ground-penetrating radar that allows us to see what we are digging into beforehand. So, are we going to pretend that there's going to be a miraculous new invention of pickaxes or shovels or something? And by the way, if he insists that they are continuing to excavate the site today as he has stated, well then he is essentially admitting that they're doing so right now with destructive methods. So, which is it? And that is why I don't buy it at all. This is gaslighting.
Aside from his continued obsession with extracting pillars, Corsetti demonstrates how little he really knows about actual archaeology. First, all archaeologists are aware that excavation is always destructive. That's why we have to be judicious about when, where, and how we do it. And excavating a site is not just brushes and power washers, or picks and shovels. Sites like Uruk, Nineveh, and Troy that were excavated in the 19th or early 20th century often involved hundreds of unskilled laborers who indeed used picks and shovels and irretrievably destroyed a lot of evidence that we'd love to have today. In those days, no one thought to save bits of charcoal or charred seeds, for example, because radiocarbon dating wasn't invented until 1948. Flotation of sediments from excavations to recover tiny plant remains that today tell archaeologists so much about ancient economies didn't start until the 1960s. No one would have thought to collect samples for OSL dating or for microrefuse analysis until after about 1985. Only in the last few years have archaeologists been able to document their excavations with LiDAR on their phones. Even the ground-penetrating radar that Corsetti obviously thinks is important didn't begin to be used in archaeology until the 1970s, and it's much better now than it was then. Archaeological methods do develop over time, and it would be highly arrogant to assume that we've already perfected every method that could be developed. Lee Clare was absolutely right. But Corsetti's consistent obsession is with the concept of fully excavating the site. His misleading quotes of archaeologists are technically correct to the extent that archaeologists admit that they will not fully excavate the site anytime soon. But that is hardly surprising, as I've shown with other examples of important sites, not to mention the astronomical cost that would involve. In short, hardly any sites, no matter how important they are, ever get fully excavated. In actual archaeology, it's actually unethical and would be the real borderline crime against humanity to excavate an entire site just for the sake of doing so, unless it was already slated for demolition or something like that. Archaeology is expensive and destructive, so we excavate only as much as we need to answer research questions. For about the same money, I could excavate 100% of one site or 5% of 20 sites. I think we'd learn a lot more from 5% of 20 sites. Would I like to see the team at Göbekli Tepe uncover more monumental buildings? Of course I would. But I'm also glad that some of the massive resources being marshaled to excavate the sites in the Şanlıurfa district of Turkey are being spent on Karahan Tepe, Çakmak Tepe, Seyburj, Sefer Tepe, and other sites, rather than spending all of it on Göbekli Tepe, as impactful and exciting as that site is. Thank you, and stay safe.